So now we're going to get into the respiratory system and talk about how the respiratory system is going to help with the gas exchange, as well as a little bit of acid-base balance on top of that. So we're going to talk about the respiratory system. We're going to get through some of the functional anatomy, then get into the alveoli, and then talk about ventilation and perfusion and what those mean and how they're linked together. So we know the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system, they really do function hand in hand. And so sometimes we call them a cardiopulmonary supersystem, right? Because the two of them really do rely on each other to be able to make these exchanges, both within the lungs and the tissues, of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So the respiratory system is going to be involved on the external side of that respiration, whereas the cardiovascular system is going to be involved in the transport and the internal respiration that happens. If either of these systems has problems, the other is just by nature going to be affected, right? And so this is going, if either of them have some sort of problem, right, cells, the tissues as a whole are going to suffer. So we're going to go through the anatomy really fast. This should be relatively familiar because of anatomy in Bio 5, but just in case we forgot, right, we know we have an upper and a lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract is your nose, pharynx, mouth, and all the structures that go within the mouth. And then the lower respiratory system is going to be the larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. Right? If you are dealing with the upper side, then you're going to be looking at ENTs. If you're looking at the lower end, you're looking at pulmonology. And so if we think about the way that air travels, and again, we're going to assume this person is breathing through their nose. They're going to bring air in through the nasal cavity, down to the pharynx, through the larynx, the trachea, the right and left primary bronchi, the secondary bronchi, the tertiary bronchi, the terminal bronchioles, the respiratory bronchioles, and then finally at the very, very end, we are at the alveolar sacs, right at the very, very end. And keep in mind this picture here is not to scale, right? We're at, a large scale here at the trachea and the bronchi, but as we get down to the alveolar sacs, we're getting very, very, very small. And so we really can divide the respiratory system into two other ways, right, in terms of function. So we had like an upper and a lower division, and now we have a conducting versus a respiratory zone. Conducting zone is going to be kind of a preparatory zone. This is where we're going to move air, to the lungs. We're also going to prep the air, so we're going to warm it up, we're going to humidify it, we're going to add some water to it, and we're going to filter the air, so particles, things that could cause damage to the more sensitive lung tissue. We're going to filter those things out. So we have mucus that can trap those particles. We have cilia to help move them away. All that mucus with the nasty stuff embedded in it. And so this is going to be the terminal bronchioles and everything upward. The respiratory zone is where we're actually performing gas exchange. And this is going to be the respiratory bronchioles and the alveolar ducts, sacs, and alveoli. Now, even though this gas exchange can happen in any of those structures, we're pretty much going to be focusing on the alveoli, and that's what I'm going to really talk about for the most part here, is I'm going to put my emphasis on the alveoli. So let's go ahead and just talk ourselves through. We have the nasal interior, if we're talking about how air is coming in. This is where we are going to warm air, we're going to moisten it, we're going to filter it. This is also where we do our odor detection, and we have these large chambers to help us with speech sounds, right? As we move down to the pharynx, right, this is what we would casually call the throat. We have three regions. We have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx, which are named for the things that they are in contact with. So the nasopharynx is in contact with the nasal cavity. The oropharynx is in contact with the oral cavity, right? Things of that nature. So we do have lymphatic tissue here. This is where we can find tonsils, where we have lymphatic tissue to help provide some immune protection, right? As we keep moving down, we get to the larynx, which is also called your voice box. This is where you have your vocal folds, also known as your vocal cords, and this is for your speech and sound. With that, we have the epiglottis. The epiglottis is going to cover The glottis also, like that's basically the opening going into the larynx, so the epiglottis will cover that opening. And so that way when we are eating food and we swallow food, that food goes down to the esophagus and it doesn't go down the trachea. The vocal folds are gonna vibrate and kind of like, you know, as we speak, right, we're pushing air through those and they're gonna vibrate, and how they vibrate is basically how we make that sound. The trachea is going to be this really like reinforced tube. So we have these C-shaped rings going down, these cartilaginous rings going down, right? Giving us some structure and making sure that the airway does not collapse, right? And then down, right, we get to this carina, which we see it's almost like a triangular piece there. And this is where we're going to make that separation into the left and the right bronchi. These lungs, so if we're getting down to the lungs are going to contain that bronchial kind of tree, as well as all the alveoli. They are held within their own membranes. We call these the pleural membranes. So these are going to kind of help create a seal around the lungs so that we have a pressurized cavity, so a pressurized space. We need to be able to seal this so we can create these changes in pressure between the inside and the out. The pleural cavity, there is a really small space between the pleural, visceral, and parietal membrane. So remember, parietal is going to be on the kind of outer edge. Visceral is going to be closer to the lungs. And we have a fluid there called pleural fluid. Sometimes this can get inflamed, and this is where we have like a sharp chest pain with inhalation, or like a dull ache. Right, that's when the inflammation has hit the pleural membranes. And then this is more important than anything else on this slide, or really, I guess, is the intrapleural pressure. This is basically the pressure of the pleural cavity. This has to be lower than the pressure inside the lungs, and this is to make sure the lungs stay inflated. Right, if this intrapleural pressure were to go up, then the lungs would collapse, right? And so there's certain things that can be done. There's certain injuries, there's certain things that can cause a collapsed lung. One of the treatments for it is to put in not a stent, a one-way valve. Right, so using something like a catheter with a one-way valve that will let air escape from that area without getting back in, so that the pressure can go back down, and then the lungs can stay inflated. So every segment of the lungs is going to have all sorts of tissue working with it, including lymphatics, arterioles, venules, the terminal bronchioles, the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, and the alveoli. And the alveoli, which are these like blackberry looking structures you see here, these are the end pieces where pretty much most of the gas exchange is going to happen. And there's two types of cells that make up these alveoli. We have the type 1 and the type 2 alveolar cells. Type 1, these are simple squamous epithelial cells. This is their job is pretty much gas exchange. So you can think of the first job that the lungs have, or the first job that the alveoli have, is for gas exchange. So type 1 alveolar cells do that. Type 2, these ones are going to be secreting a surfactant. So this is to help keep the alveoli open, right? So they don't collapse in on themselves. So surfactant helps prevent them from kind of collapsing in and sticking to themselves. And when we're saying gas exchange, what we're really talking about is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And since we're talking about the lungs, we're talking about external respiration, which means we're making that exchange between the alveoli and the capillary membrane. This is super, super thin. We only have 2 layers of cells here. And this is going to make this really easy, really quick and efficient, right? So basically you have like the one cell from the capillary side and the one cell from the alveolar side. So 2 cells maximum is what we have to pass through when we are oxygen or carbon dioxide. Now, to get to the lungs, we have blood vessels to help us. We have pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins. Remember that arteries and veins are defined by their direction, not necessarily their oxygen content. And so in this case, the pulmonary arteries, which are leaving the heart on the right side, these ones have very little oxygen, and because they've just come back from the body and they haven't gone through the lungs yet, and then as the blood returns from the lungs back to the heart through the pulmonary veins, we have a lot of oxygen back in that blood. Now, the ventilation perfusion coupling, basically this is saying that when you have this response to hypoxia, meaning low oxygen, vasoconstriction will happen to kind of make sure that blood goes towards the areas that are like poorly ventilated to areas that are well ventilated in the lungs. So basically, like if there's an area of the lungs that is not performing gas exchange very well, we will basically divert blood away from those alveoli and go towards the alveoli that are actually working.